Hello, everyone. I am Shannon Ballman Theis, the Payroll Queen, and today we are going to be discussing the IRS notice that they sent out on January 23rd about it's a question and answer about the new deduction for qualified overtime compensation. So I'm just going to share my screen so that you all can see it. All right. So, on IRS.gov, their newsroom, they have a question and answers about the new deduction for qualified overtime compensation. And I'll make sure that the link will be in the description below. Okay, so this is a fact sheet, and it's fact sheet 2026-01. And it was released January 23rd, 2026. And the fact sheet provides answers to frequently asked questions about the new deduction for qualified overtime compensation, such as who might be eligible to claim the deduction, including federal employees, and where to find supplemental information on eligibility and other rules. These FAQs are being issued to provide general information to taxpayers and tax professionals as expeditiously as possible. Accordingly, these FAQs may not address any particular taxpayer-specific facts and circumstances, and they may be updated or modified upon further review. Because these FAQs have not been published in the Internal Revenue Bulletin, they will not be relied on or used by the IRS to resolve a case. So what that means is the IRS is providing FAQs, and the FAQs are not going to be relied upon by the IRS if a taxpayer relies upon these in order to file their tax return and the rules later change. The IRS is going to use different source documents, which would be the original bill. So that gets a little confusing because it is published on the IRS website, but it's basically saying use these at your own discretion. So similarly, if an FAQ turns out to be an inaccurate statement of the law as applied to a particular taxpayer's case, the law will control the taxpayer's tax liability, not the FAQs. Nonetheless, a taxpayer who reasonably and in good faith relies on these FAQs will not be subject to a penalty that provides a reasonable cause standard for relief, including a negligence penalty or an accuracy-related penalty to the extent that reliance results in an underpayment of tax. So this is kind of where it seems like it contradicts itself, but basically what this is saying is that the IRS is going to kind of look at why the taxpayer made the mistake, and if it can be directly tied back to the FAQs, then the taxpayer will not get additional penalties assessed. They'll still be responsible for like an underpayment penalty and such. Any later updates or modification to these FAQs will be dated to enable taxpayers to confirm the date on which any changes to the FAQs were made. Additionally, prior versions of the FAQs will be maintained on irs.gov to ensure taxpayers who may have relied on a prior version can locate that version if they later need to do so. And what I always recommend doing is whenever you're working on something and have questions about it, and so like if a tax preparer is looking at these FAQs and they're filing a tax return today or tomorrow, and these are the FAQs that are up, then I print them. I save my own copy so that I can say, nope, here, and I've got the date that I printed it, and everything is this is what I relied upon. That saves everybody the stress of trying to find the right version, the right date and everything. And then there's more information about Reliance is available if you click Reliance here. And then the FAQs were announced in IR 2026-10, which is another page here. So I'm just we're going to sidebar and we're going to discuss this, and then we're going to go back. So on January 23rd, 2026, IR 2026-10 was released, and it says that the Department of Treasury and the Internal Revenue Service today issued frequently asked questions in fact sheet 2026-01, which is where we just were, related to the new deduction for qualified overtime compensation under the One Big Beautiful Bill, or OB3, for tax years 2025 through 2028. Individuals who receive qualified overtime compensation may deduct the amount that exceeds their regular rate of pay, in general, the half portion of the time and a half of compensation, and is reported on Form W-2 or Form 1099. The FAQs contain additional information about the deduction, provide resources for employees, including federal employees, to assist them in determining whether they received qualified overtime compensation under the Fair Labor Standards Act, and contain useful information regarding the differences in reporting requirements for tax year 2025 and 26 to 28, because the rules are different for 25 than they will be for 26, 27, and 28. Treasury and IRS previously issued Notice 2025-62, providing penalty relief to employers and the payers for tax year 2025 regarding the new information reporting requirements for qualified overtime compensation, and issued Notice 2025-69 for workers eligible to claim the deduction for overtime compensation for 2025. For more information, go directly to the OB3 on irs.gov. I'm not going to discuss the Notice 2025-62 or 2025-69 here in this video. All right, so the background. OB3 added a new deduction for qualified overtime compensation, which and Notice 2025-69 clarifies for individuals how to determine the amount of their deduction for qualified overtime compensation for the 2025 tax year. Below are answers to some questions about the new deduction for qualified overtime compensation. Question 1. What is qualified overtime compensation for purposes of the deduction? Answer. Qualified overtime compensation is overtime compensation paid to an individual required under Section 7 of the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA, that exceeds the regular rate at which the individual is employed. For example, if an individual is paid at 1.5 times their regular rate for an hour of overtime work that is required by FLSA, the half portion of the 1.5 time paid for an hour of overtime work is qualified overtime compensation. So let's just put some numbers to this. If somebody is normally paid $10 an hour, their time and a half is $15 an hour, so their qualified overtime is $5 an hour. For overtime to be required under FLSA, it must, among other requirements, be paid to an individual who is both covered by FLSA and not exempt from FLSA's overtime requirement. An individual who is ineligible for overtime under FLSA does not receive qualified overtime compensation regardless of other laws or circumstances, such as collective bargaining agreements providing for overtime pay. So this part of the question addresses, I always use California as an example because they're the best example I have on the top of my head. for this. So, like in California, if somebody works more than 8 hours in a day, they get paid overtime. They don't have to have worked 40 hours, which is required by FLSA in order to get overtime. Somebody can work 15 hours in a week, but if they worked 10 hours on one day, they're going to have 2 hours of overtime. That is not FLSA overtime. Individuals eligible for overtime under FLSA generally must receive overtime pay for hours worked in excess of 40 hours in a work week at a rate not less than 1.5 times their regular rate of pay. If an individual is eligible for overtime under FLSA, but the individual's employer pays more than is required under FLSA, the qualified overtime compensation is limited to the portion of overtime that is required by FLSA that is in excess of the regular rate. For example, if an employer pays double the individual's regular rate for hours worked over 40 hours in a work week, only the 1/2 portion of that is relied upon to comply with the FLSA requirement is qualified overtime compensation. So what that means is if somebody works more than 40 hours in a work week and anything that they work over that 40 hours, if they get paid double time. So in our example from before, they get paid $10 an hour regular pay, but their overtime is calculated at $20 an hour. Still only that $5 an hour is qualified overtime. Question 2. How do I determine whether I am covered by and not exempt from FLSA? In other words, how do I determine if I am an FLSA overtime eligible employee? Answer. Though it is common for employees working in the United States to be covered by FLSA, there are many exemptions from its overtime premium requirement. Whether an individual is covered by and not exempt under FLSA is a fact-specific determination that depends on the individual's occupation, work activities, and/or earnings. More information on coverage and exemption under FLSA can be found on the Department of Labor website, and you will have the link to this page, which will give you the link to go to the Department of Labor website fact sheet number 14 that will cover it, and fact sheet number 8, which is a handy reference guide to the Fair Labor Standards Act. Question number 3. I am a federal employee. How do I know whether I am an FLSA overtime eligible employee? Answer. FLSA eligible for federal employees is typically documented on the employee's Standard Form 50, Notification of Personnel Action, see Block 35. FLSA Category E means exempt from FLSA ineligible, and N means non-exempt or FLSA overtime eligible. Under 29 U.S. Code Section 204F, the Office of Personnel Management administers FLSA for most federal employees. So there's going to be two different OPM FLSA regulation and a fact sheet that federal employees can take a look at. Although OPM administers the FLSA for most federal employees, there are some exceptions. For example, Department of Labor's FLSA regulation and guidance over employees of the Library of Congress, U.S. Post Office, and the Postal Regulatory Commission and Tennessee Valley Authority you have to see 29 USC 204F. Additionally, the Office of Congressional Workplace Rights regulates the FLSA for legislative branch employees. So you're going to see OCWR rules and regulations, Fair Labor Standards Act. Again, the link to the page that I am on is here. And so you'll have access to this, to the link to go to any of the fact sheets or regulations that we're discussing here. Question 4. What is the deduction amount? Are there limitations to the deduction? Answer. The deduction is up to $12,500 of qualified overtime compensation earned for the year, or $25,000 in the case of a joint return. The deduction is reduced if a taxpayer's modified adjusted gross income for the tax year exceeds $150,000 or $300,000 for joint filers. And again, you're going to take a look at Notice 2025-69 for more information on how to calculate MAGI for this purpose. Question 5. Are there rules that apply to the deduction? Answer. Yes, of course. There's always other rules. It can't just be simple, right? The taxpayer who receives the qualified overtime compensation must have a Social Security number valid for employment and must include the Social Security number on the tax return claiming the deduction. If the taxpayer is married within the meaning of Section 7703, the taxpayer and the taxpayer spouse must file a joint return to claim the deduction. If both spouses receive qualified overtime compensation, both spouses must have a Social Security number valid for employment and must include both Social Security numbers on the joint tax return claiming the deduction. Question 6. Will qualified overtime compensation be separately reported to individuals on Form W-2, Form 1099 NEC, or Form 1099 miscellaneous? Doesn't qualified overtime have to be separately reported in order for an individual to take the deduction? And the answer to this question is it depends on the year. Because don't all accounting and tax related questions always include at least one answer of it depends. Okay, so for tax year 2025, employers and other payers are not required to report qualified overtime compensation separately on Form W-2, 1099 NEC, or 1099 miscellaneous. And that is where you're going to take a look at Notice 2025-62. For 2025, some employers and other payers may choose to separately report the amount of qualified overtime compensation to employees using Box 14 of Form W-2 to the employees or payers through an online portal or a separate statement. If individuals do not receive a Form W-2 or other statement from their employer or other payer for the tax year 2025 that separately reports the amount of qualified overtime compensation, they may use the methods described in Notice 2025-69 and the instructions to Schedule 1A that are included in the instructions for Form 1040 to calculate the amount of qualified overtime compensation. So basically, with what this answer is saying for tax year 2025 is there really isn't one singular method of telling people what the qualified overtime is. It's optional to put it on the W-2. It's not required. There's not a built-in mechanism for it. It's not something that most payroll software is equipped to do. I know in my firm, all of the qualified overtime needs to be manually calculated and manually input into Box 14. And that was a separate engagement than just creating the regular W-2s for our regular recurring payroll clients. And just the really quick version of the methods described in Notice 2025-69 is for tax year 2025 only, you can take the amount of overtime that's reported on the pay stub, divide that by 3 to get what is going to be called qualified overtime for 2025. It may or may not. It may include overtime that is not technically qualified overtime, but because there's not a method, they're not going to penalize people if the qualified overtime that they're reporting on their Schedule 1A, if it exceeds what they should have done. However, for tax year 2026 and later, employers and other payers are required to separately report qualified overtime compensation on the forms W-2, 1099 NEC, and 1099 miscellaneous will all be updated to allow employers and other payers to provide separate reporting of an individual's qualified overtime compensation. And I'm going to say right now, the payroll softwares that I have experience with, this is a difficult process to make sure that whatever is put into qualified overtime, I recommend right now, and this is the beginning of 2026 when I'm reporting this, while everything is all still new, what we're doing is we're still keeping track of qualified overtime and non-qualified overtime separately on an Excel spreadsheet for all the employees who do pay a combination of FLSA overtime and non-FLSA overtime. Question 7. I am an FLSA overtime eligible employee and I did not receive information from my employer on how much qualified overtime compensation I received during tax year 2025. How can I find out more information to help me? And we already kind of discussed this in the last question, but you go to 2025-69 and that gives the information to help individuals determine the deduction for qualified overtime for 2025 only. If you are an FLSA overtime eligible federal employee, special rules may apply to you with respect to calculating your qualified overtime compensation. You have to click on the link to see how to compute FLSA overtime pay for a fact sheet applicable to most federal employees. Please contact your agency's human resource office or payroll provider for further assistance. Question 8. Where can I get more information on FLSA and overtime pay in general? So you're going to go to the WHD fact sheet, overtime pay general guidance link, and the handy resource guide for the Fair Labor Standards Act. But if you're a federal employee covered by OPM issued FLSA regulations, you have to see the OPM FLSA fact sheet titled How to Compute FLSA Overtime Pay. Please let me know if you have any additional questions on this fact sheet. If you need me to go into more detail on any of the notices, definitely leave your comments in the video below. And as always, I get into YouTube a couple of times a week to answer all of the questions. So thank you for watching. And this is Shannon Ballman Theis, your payroll queen, signing off. Thank you for watching. Bye.